Have you ever realized that occupational diseases constitute a silent epidemics? I mean diseases that you don't hear much about, but they occur every day, everywhere, in every country, and they affect a huge number of workers. According to the International Labour Office, every year more than 2.3 million workers die from occupational accidents and diseases, and about 160,000 new cases of occupational diseases occur, and attention, any figure you see about occupational diseases is an underestimation, because reported cases are just the tip of a huge iceberg. For example, the Pan American Health Organization estimates that in Latin America, not quite 5% of occupational diseases are duly reported. In my opinion, humanity involves understanding and concern for the impact that our actions, and also something very important, our lack of action will have on others. And of course, at least trying to do something about it. There are many aspects of humanity and work, and I emphasize that I'm just going to give you a brief glimpse, well, a glimpse is brief, just a glimpse of a few aspects related to my professional experience, which is prevention in the workplace. Work is essential for all of us. Have you imagined the number of people who have worked so that all of you could be here today, well-fed, well-dressed, with your clothes, your shoes, your cell phones? Have you thought about that? Unfortunately, indispensable activities such as agriculture, food production, manufacturing, construction, energy production, services including health services, they require processes, equipment, and materials which can pose hazards to health and to the environment. These hazards are chemicals, such as solvents and pesticides, physical agents, such as heat and noise, mineral dusts, vegetable dust, cotton dust, wood, biological agents, such as viruses and molds, ergonomic factors, repetitive movement, I'm sure all of you do that, and psychosocial factors, which are very important, and they lead to the so talked about today, occupational stress. The consequences are many, and I'm just going to give you a few examples concerning chemicals. Intoxication, cancer, asphyxia, lung diseases, endocrine disruption, effects on human reproduction. Unborn babies may be affected, future generations can be affected. Not to speak about the subclinical conditions that are never reported, but really impact on quality of life. I like to say a word about the hidden hazards, because they are hidden, and many people don't expect them. And they occur, they are toxic chemicals that occur as impurities, such as benzene in less toxic solvents, and also as a result of chemical reactions, of decomposition of organic matter, and of thermal decomposition. We had a tragic event last year in our state, a nightclub fire. More than 200 young people died, not from the fire, but from cyanides released when the polyurethanes burned. The effects can be acute, but they can appear much later. I want to show you this graph. Look at the graph. You'll see the blue line. Okay, mesothelioma is the typical cancer caused, it's a lung cancer caused by asbestos. Well, in the UK, the amphibols were banned in '85 and chrysotile in '99. And yet, if you look at the mesothelioma annual deaths in the UK, they are going up, and they are expected to peak around 2020. Why? Because of the latency of carcinogenic agents. People may be exposed now, and the consequence may appear sometimes decades later. And this is a very underestimated hazard. Of course, we cannot speak about humanity and work without saying a word about the terror of slave work and child labor. These are issues that cannot be ignored. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UN does touch on aspects of work. Just look at Article 23. While I take a breath, you just read Article 23. Just to show. Anyway. Work should not destroy the individual. Work should fulfill and dignify the human being. Moreover, Many toxic chemicals may leave workplaces in the form of effluents, residues, waste, and products. And they may affect the environment, air, water, soil, nature, animals, plants, and they can affect communities, not only surrounding communities, but very far away. For example, dioxins were detected in breast milk in some regions of the Arctic where there are no dioxin sources. They can also affect consumers, of course. I just show you this graph so that you can visualize the spread of a chemical from the plant to the environment. We can have workers' exposure, we can have emissions, we can have liquid effluents, we can have consumers' products. Everything has to be disposed of in the end. Anyway, chemicals go from one environmental compartment to the other. And what we should do, if we avoid or strictly control chemicals in the workplace, we avoid all the spread and all the expensive mitigation measures that are required later on. I want to give the example of mercury. Mercury is extremely toxic. It can affect many organs, including the central nervous system, giving symptoms similar to madness. And everybody knows the character, the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland, but not everybody knows that in English, the expression as mad as a hatter has its origin in mercury poisoning, because in the old days, they used mercury to treat the felt for hats. Anyway, mercury is not created and it cannot be destroyed. It goes from one environmental compartment to the other if we don't stop it. It's become such a global issue that last year, 92 countries signed the Minamata Convention on Mercury that has, its objective is to reduce the uses and global emissions of mercury. It's called Minamata because in the 50s and 60s, a whole village was poisoned in the Minamata Bay in Japan. I wanted just to briefly give you an example that we have in the Amazonian. It's an example of a hazard for workers, for the communities, and for the environment. And this is the small-scale gold mining using the gold extraction by amalgamation with mercury. They mix the ore, they grind and mix the ore with mercury, which amalgamates with the gold. Later on, the amalgam is heated, mercury is evaporated, and the gold remains. You can imagine the extent of workers' exposure, communities' exposure, and also the environmental damage that this causes. We have it in the Amazonian, but it happens in around 70 countries, and it's estimated that about 15 million people are involved in this. I want to show you this graph. Look just at the red numbers. Okay, a scientist made a study of mercury in fish in some Amazonian rivers. Now, the maximum allowable concentration of mercury in fish, at least in Brazil, is 0.5 micrograms per gram. I put in red the highest value he found to impress you, but if you look, our values are quite impressive. That is 5,500 micrograms per gram, and that's 11,000 times the maximum allowable concentration. So you can imagine the environmental damage that mercury is causing in many places in the world. There are also the great disasters. We had Bhopal, Chernobyl, the Deep Horizon rig in the Gulf of Mexico. All of this happened by lack of prevention in the workplace. Why do I insist? Because the prevention in the workplace is not given its due consideration. And that's why so many disasters occur. What happened? In all of them, faulty equipment, faulty material, failure in safety devices, failure involves, and in many cases, lack of emergency preparedness. There is also the economic impact of occupational diseases and accidents. The ILO made a study in developed countries, mainly Nordic countries, and the conclusion was that the expenses with occupational diseases and accidents can be up to 4% of the gross domestic product, and it's estimated that in developing countries it might be worse. Anyway, very briefly, I try to present you a scenario, and it's kind of scary. I mean, we need development, we need industrialization, we need chemicals, including to save lives. Pharmaceuticals, we need pharmaceuticals. However, unfortunately, chemicals can also cause a lot of harm and can even kill us. What to do? We don't want to go back to living in caves with no electricity and no books, well, at least most of us don't. So what we have to do is prevention. Prevention, prevention, and prevention should start in the workplace. It's not the only type of prevention, but it's a very important aspect that's very often overlooked. That's why I insist, and I'm grateful I have the occasion to speak to many decision makers or future decision makers here. To give you a couple of examples of measures concerning chemicals, you can substitute chemicals, you can modify equipment, you can have enclosed operations. The gold mining thing can be done in retorts, enclosed, but of course it's more expensive. We can have local exhaust ventilation with air cleaning devices. So there are many measures, but the most important is anticipated preventive action. That's really important. What is that? It's to recognize and then avoid or control hazards at the planning and design stage. Whenever designing or selecting equipment, work processes, workplaces, whenever selecting materials and substances to be used, key considerations that cannot be overlooked: workers' health, environmental protection, and energy consumption. In this connection, a very important concept is life cycle assessment, LCA. And that means the assessment of a chemical or a product since its extraction or creation throughout its whole life, passing by manufacturing, use, disposal, whatever, until its final disposal. And this is a very important consideration that's sometimes overlooked. We know a lot about hazards and their prevention. Unfortunately, there is a wide knowledge application gap. Why the knowledge we have is not always applied at the workplace level? There are many reasons, but one of them, I think the beginning of it all, is insufficient or lack of political will on the part of decision makers. Who are the decision makers who could make a difference concerning prevention? At different levels we all are, but I would mention some: legislators, policymakers, politicians, designers, engineers, architects, occupational health and safety professionals, environmentalists, educators, media professionals, managers, and workers, among others. But there is one group to which we all belong, and it's a group that has more power than we think: consumers. Products and services are targeted to consumers, and consumers don't really care, usually, don't really care very much what happened. And I ask you, should we buy products without knowing what was involved in their manufacturing? Have workers been killed? Do we have pesticide residues in our food? Do we have lead in toys? Do we have mercury in our cosmetics? I think that if and when consumers are well aware of all the implications of all the health issues involved in products and services, some of us will make better choices. I wanted to give you an example in the fashion industry. Sandblasting to give jeans a faded look. I'm sure many of you will have the jeans with the faded look. Anyway, first I asked, do we really need that? Because many needs are created. There are things we don't really need, and they cause a lot of harm, and I think we should think twice about that. But anyway, this sandblasting has been done in many countries with no controls, and it has led to thousands of cases of silicosis and many deaths among workers, some of them very young. Silicosis is a terrible disease. It's progressive and it is incurable. And it's not justifiable that to have faded jeans, somebody should die. I must say that several companies have discontinued this, but it's still used in many countries. I wanted to say a word about sustainable development. Everybody knows what sustainable development is. I'm not going to say what it is. What I want to emphasize is that there is a need for a global perspective when dealing with such an important issue. And I'll try to illustrate what I want to say with two, and I already warned you, oversimplified examples. It's just to illustrate what I want to say. It's recycling and planting trees, commendable and necessary and wonderful actions. Recycling, very important to save on resources and also to minimize waste. But recycling is not always clean and green. Let's suppose we have a product that contains a very toxic chemical, let's say lead, and then that product is going to be recycled. The recycled product will still contain the toxic chemical, not to speak about the recycling workers that most of the times they are not protected because it's considered a green job anyway. But anyway, we have the recycled product still containing the toxic chemical, and this will eventually be disposed of, and the toxic chemical will go to the environment. So the ideal would be to avoid the toxic chemical in the original article. Then we could speak about clean and green recycling. Planting trees. To plant a tree is wonderful. It has to be done. But I want to give you an example. Suppose a tree dies. It's oversimplified, but suppose a tree dies because of acid rain. Many forests have. I plant a new tree. The new tree will also die unless whatever caused the acid rain will be stopped. What I mean is that to deal only with the consequences, it's not enough. We have to search for the causes and fight the causes. In order to attain economic, social, and sustainable development, that is, to develop, to industrialize, to have a good quality of life, we all want that, to respect workers, to respect the environment, to avoid environmental degradation, to avoid climate change, to attain that, we must see the broad picture. I see an urgent need in our society everywhere for a shift from a reactive to a proactive mentality. A reactive mentality is necessary because if harm is done, we have to fix it. But in the case of the tree, we are planting the new tree. That's reactive. It was killed because of the acid rain. The proactive would be to avoid the acid rain. When an oil spill occurs, billions, as in the Gulf of Mexico, are spent to clean up, to pay people. Everybody is ready, NGOs, everybody works. But then when it is the question of avoiding the spill, you know, there is not so much movement around that. Some decision makers seem to wear blinders and they only see the short-term profit without really and carefully appreciating the long-term consequences and losses. Science and technology are needed, but the negative impact should be prevented, and it can be prevented. I read somewhere that Gandhi, the great Gandhi, considered as a sin science without humanity. And I think we spoke today a lot about technology, and I think that that's a consideration that all people involved with technology should think about. Science without humanity is a sin. Technology without humanity is a sin. To finalize, I'd like to say that work, health, environment, quality of life, natural resources, they are all connected. Their protection is a must, but their protection requires not only knowledge, but also vision, responsibility, commitment, and humanity. And speaking for my own field, I think that in the case of work-related hazards, humanity is their prevention. Thank you.